Welcome back. It's Web Wednesdays.
Web Wednesdays.
And we're doing Node.js. That does not roll off my tongue. I'm sorry. We're doing Node.js, and we're going to be just starting in on our second module, which is kind of explaining the Express framework and how that works with Node.
We're really happy that you guys are back, to be honest. Thank you so much. Hopefully Express is going to be one of those tools that you'll use frequently. After you see how awesome it is. Yeah.
A couple things that we can do is quickly just answer a couple of questions that came up in the chat room, and we'll just quickly try to roll those in. One thing to note is that we're using Visual Studio to kind of go through some of the Node projects. There's, and I think I'll bring up the link here. There is Node.js tools for Visual Studio, and I have the link here that we can see on my screen, and it's basically you can download these, you can install them, and so if you go to create a new project or a new Node or Express project, it'll have those templates for you. Provide some of those tools. It will recognize those things happening in Visual Studio for you.
Yeah, and you'll see us using it towards the 6th module where we'll start doing some remote debugging with Azure with the tools for Visual Studio.
Right.
So you'll be able to see it in action.
Yeah, exactly. A couple other questions that kind of came up, was... let's see. A couple of people mentioned just, blocking I/O versus non-blocking I/O. If you have something that you're doing that's a kind of like a big operation, the best advice I think we can possibly give is just go asynchronous all the way.
Yeah.
And once again, it's got to be one of those things where you got to consider, depending on what you're doing, if it's really data heavy.
Yeah. Let's say you're editing some video. And your service edits some video in the back end. What you'll want to do, ideally, is run it as async as possible. And one of the ways you could do that is by literally spinning up another process. There's the process module that will let you do that very simply. And you'll be able to assign a callback. So when that process is done, you'll actually get the result of it. So you don't have to run things on your server event loop at all.
Yeah.
It's one of the things that you could do for long-running operations that are really mandatory and blocking.
Right. So just that, once again, it's one of those things you got to consider architecturally and when you're building your application. We had another question just quickly. What is TypeScript? TypeScript is produced by Microsoft.
Right.
It extends the functionality of JavaScript. Unlike some other kind of, there's variations that people kind of slotted in with CoffeeScript and things like that. TypeScript kind of extends it. So plain JavaScript will work. TypeScript. And it gives you strict typing is one of the number one features with it. So you get that idea of, especially if you come from a language where it's a little more structured, you got strict typing, all that kind of good data stuff that you don't get right out of the box in JavaScript. TypeScript extends. So it's worth checking into if you come from, let's say, not a JavaScript background and you're coming from something where you're, like C# or that kind of thing where you're used to that kind of, ability to type to variables and things like that.
Yeah, it's really powerful if you want to do some static typing. It's a superset on top of JavaScript, so all of your JavaScript code will work, but the additions that TypeScript offers only works if you're then using TypeScript to recompile it down into basic JavaScript. So it's very similar to the way CoffeeScript works, if you've used CoffeeScript before.
Right. The beauty of TypeScript is that your JavaScript will just work. You don't have to worry about anything else. So you can, write a line of JavaScript, or you can, write it in TypeScript and you're fine.
Yeah.
We got audio is fading in and out since the break. Thank you. We'll take a look into that. Awesome. Number one suggestion for audio problems, refresh the page, always. So let's start getting into Express a little bit and talking about, the Express framework and, how it works with Node. And, how we can use it and show a simple example of maybe building a really, really basic REST API. one of the things you can start to do if you're, not sure how you want to use Node is that Node is really great. I mean, all those server-side languages, but Node's great for really quickly getting up and running an API of some sort. Maybe you need to get data that's pulled in from somewhere. Maybe you need to create something that's like fake data because whoever is doing the services hasn't, finished the services yet. Any of those kind of things, you can get up and running and build something like that in Node quite easily, and have, something working and that you can test with, that you're not just pulling in a JSON file or writing a bunch of objects out that you think are going to emulate the data. So, that's for me, that was one of the first uses of Node that I came across. I was like, I think I'm just going to build a basic API, because I always need those. I always need to save data or get data or, whatever it may be. So, when we're going to talk about Express in this module, we're going to talk about, okay, what is Express? Some people call it Express Web Framework, Express Framework. I hear it mostly as Express. We're going to talk about installing and using Express. We're going to demo, creating a very simple REST API and kind of show you where you could go with it a little bit. And we're going to talk about a couple other things in Express, whether it be templating, maybe some the idea of middleware you'll hear tossed around a lot.
Yep.
So, we'll kind of just walk through those things for you and give you kind of the basics. And again, when we start building out our chat application, which is coming up, all these things we're teaching you right now, we're going to be using. So we'll be using the Express framework. So this will give you a nice, good kind of starter point for that. So, what is Express? Often, if you're searching the web, you'll see the mean stack, for example, right? So you'll see, so that's Mongo, Express, Angular, and Node, for example. So you'll see something along those lines. You'll see Node always with Express. Sometimes it's Node, Express, Mongo, right? Angular seems to be something, a little bit client-side framework tossed in there. You tend to see them quite a bit, right?
Yeah.
And so what is Express? How would you describe Express if I said to you, okay, I know a little bit about Node. I know enough to write basically, I want to start serving up some web pages.
Yeah.
How do I handle things in terms of building out this website?
So Express is this web framework that lets you structure a web application to handle multiple different HTTP requests at a specific URL. So if you remember when we did our HTTP server, we had one callback that would handle all the requests that our HTTP servers got. But as you know, websites are not just one page for the most part. They might have different URLs. Express lets you structure your program so that you can handle multiple URLs and multiple HTTP requests, whether it's a get, post, put, patch, delete, and handle it in a very simple way and straightforward way. And you'll see that when we're going to use it to create a very simple REST API that will handle a get request for our front end, whatever front end we're building.
Right. And so, Express is one of those things that's really handy if you're building out a whole website, but also if you're just building out an API, because sometimes all you need is that endpoint, and then you're okay, I need students, and I need to get students, I need to put students, I need to, any of those CRUD operations that you might do, right?
Exactly.
So it's really easy to get up and running there.
Yeah, and there's very simple ways to use Express to return JSON properly with the right content type with a simple function call. So you don't have to set everything manually like we did in our HTTP demo.
Yeah, or going in through some other languages, for example, you're writing headers and you're writing all this other kind of stuff before you return stuff. Express, when you think about Express, it's important to note that it works with Node. It's for Node. And a lot of times when you come from a front-end background, at least I feel like this has been my experience, coming from a front-end, moving into Node, okay, there's JavaScript on the server, there's JavaScript on the front, okay, my folder structure might be some here, here's my, public. Often you'll see is, that's what's client-side, here's what's not happening on the server. Express is used for Node on the server.
Yeah, it's
mostly to handle a lot of what we just mentioned about that structure of the HTTP calls.
Yeah, it's a module on your server backend, and it doesn't actually do anything on the front end. So it's strictly on the back end.
So a couple of reasons why you should use Express. If I said to you, okay, I've been looking at it, why do I need to learn yet another web framework? I feel like that's my life right now. Every time you look, there's some new framework, some new library. Why should I use why should I learn Express? Why should I spend the time?
Well, Express is fairly well established. and it's got a huge community behind it. Lots of middleware for Express that you can use to extend Express. Huge community around it. So if you're using Node and you need a framework as your default, Express, I think I would recommend would be the best one. Now, Express itself is great because it gives you support for routing, so you can handle multiple URLs. And the other neat thing is that it also supports multiple templating engines, so you can template your HTML. Nice thing about Express that I really like is that it's very simple, it's open source, very straightforward, and it's inspired by Sinatra from Ruby on Rails. So if you're coming from the Ruby language, so if you're coming from Ruby, you might recognize a lot of the stuff that we're going to be showing you today. And it's definitely
it's also, if you know any Python, it's very similar to Flask.
The Flask as well.
Yeah, so it's one of those things. When I first saw it, I was like, and I think I said this the other day, I was like, oh, it's just like Sinatra, which was like the only framework I think I've learned like in Ruby outside of Ruby and Rails, and then using Sinatra. So it was one of those things. So I think even if you're doing a simple Node application where you're going to handle more than one kind of URL, like or one kind of request at that address, probably using a framework is a good idea, because once you start to see just how easy it abstracts that stuff out for you, you'll be like, oh, that totally makes sense. It's so much cleaner. It's easier to read. I know where everything is, right? That's how I'd feel about it.
That's something that I definitely agree with. And you'll see it in some of our sample demo code. It doesn't add much lines of code to your actual code base. So you can achieve a lot with Express without having to do too much coding.
Awesome. So installing and using Express. Express, you can, basically you can get it through NPM, and you need to install it. You can install it globally, you can install it locally. And it's really just 2 commands. And what we're going to be using here, is you'll see on the screen, is we're going to be npm install Express. So I'll just basically open up the command line and I'll, run npm install Express. And I'm also installing Jade. And Jade is something that we're not going to cover in this module. We'll cover in further modules. But Jade is, templating language, for lack of better kind of terminology. Right? Yeah. And you'll see Express, because Express not only handles a lot of that the routing, it also, it has the templating features, right? So you can use a variety of different templating engines, can you not? Yeah,
you can use Mustache if that's the one that you're familiar with. Or if you're coming from the front-end environments, you've probably used Mustache, or even the underscore templating engine. You can also use that one as well. You can even create your own templating engine.
Handlebars.
Just inject it. It's really flexible, very open. You can use whatever one that you want.
Right. So we're going to kind of get into just, looking at what a basic simple REST API looks like and how it works. We're going to break down some of those things for you. And then we're also going to just kind of talk a little bit more about Express and some of the other features, like we had mentioned already, like the term middleware, which, you'll read a lot about it. And then you go to search for what is middleware. It's pretty much exactly what it sounds like, but we'll kind of walk through a little bit of those kind of things for you. So when it comes to, we're looking at making a basic kind of REST API. Again, you have your kind of routing that you need for your API, and that's where you're going to get certain kinds of information. So, you're looking to get students. You might have, an endpoint for students, for get, for post, for a student in particular, an ID, all those kind of things. So we should talk about routing a little bit and how important that is.
Yeah.
So a router maps basically your request to a callback, right? So, if we're looking at Express and we're kind of like looking at those kind of things, you'll see that we kind of register what we think that route should be. Sometimes you write it straight up as like /students. Sometimes you're writing, you can write regular expressions, those kind of things if you want to do that. Most of these requests are often, like I think you previously said, we've got get, post, right? Put, delete.
Put, patch. If you guys can name the other ones on the chat window, we'll give you bonus points.
Yeah. For how many you tend to use, right? I'm usually a get post person. I never delete anything. I just archive it. I put like a variable in the database. It's just like show or, active or whatever. But, you can delete all those kind of things. And the URLs kind of describe where the location is targeted, right?
Yeah. So Basically, with the URL, you can also set a path. So that's the target path that you want. So the minute that someone puts that in the browser, all right, and you put that in your your router in Express, the callback will be executed for that path. So that it's going to go for that target.
Right. So if you're doing something like, I want to get the information for a particular student, you would probably in your path have to include the ID or some kind of recognizer for that student. So it might be student/1, for example. And then I would use the 1 in that callback to figure out what I need to do. Exactly. Right? Maybe I'm returning a simple string. Maybe I'm going to a database. Maybe I'm taking that ID and I'm going to an API, whatever it may be. So the URL really does describe a lot of kind of like what you're doing, right?
Yeah.
And then again, we talked a little bit about a request handler and the callback. And you can see on my screen, I have an example at the bottom that's, you'll see, and this is what Express looks like. You basically kind of create an app or an Express app, and you have .get, meaning that someone's going to be getting the index, and what should happen when they get the index, that callback that should be called. And you get, your request, and you get the result of what you want to do with that, or that response, sorry. Yeah. So, routes, you start to see this across the board, whether you're using front-end frameworks. For example, you'll see the idea of a router. It's handling what's coming off the URL, and, maybe you set up the state of your application for that. And then you also are seeing it now, again, on the server side, which is a lot of frameworks, no matter what language you're in, kind of do that, because that's a lot of work to do. Right? Like setting up that stuff and figuring out what's going on. If you're going to write all that stuff yourself, that can be a fair chunk of work. So why not use a framework, right? So here's on my screen just the code for creating a simple Express application, and I'll shortly open up Visual Studio. We'll take a look at it, and I'll just run it on the command line, and I'll show you just a couple other things about Express. But if we start to look at this slide, you can start to see that we're requiring a module called Express. Once again, require, you can think of require as like you need to import something, or it's requiring it to work. And those are often, depending on what you're using or whatnot, you might instantiate and use those at the top of your file. You might do it throughout. It depends on how you tend to write your code. And then we create a variable that's instantiated to Express. So we're creating an Express app fundamentally here. And Express has a bunch of things, bunch of functions and features that you can add. And all we're doing here is we're saying when you get basically this URL, which is, I'm going to the root of the application. Here's what I want to have happen. And so you get that, you write that response, and right here you see that we're writing JSON. We're writing a basic message, with some text. And, what happens is that when you hit that URL, that's a response that we're returning to you, right? And then on the last line, we're going app.listen, and we have an environment variable there, for example. So if you guys are used to deploying stuff, maybe you work this way, locally, where you might have a local version, a production version, a staging version. Maybe you're used to, pushing stuff, no problem up to the web, and you instantiate your environment variables. We have that environment variable that we're looking for. So we're saying, it's, if this exists, use it, and if not, use 8080, right, for this example. Yeah. And that's a basic, very simple Express application. There's no bells and whistles here. Like, it's dead simple. And this is a great example of what you'd use for something that's just like a REST API. So I'm just going to open up the code in Visual Studio. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of run it on the command line and, show you that in action. So in Visual Studio, if I go to 08, Express REST, you will see, now if you're looking at my Visual Studio, you'll see right here that I have, it says, NPM, there's node modules, right? So what happens is that, I've got this local kind of node modules folder that has all of these things installed. And what you need to do with these kind of packages, if you're following along with us, what you need to do is the first thing you do when you get any kind of a Node project is that you kind of navigate to the directory that it is in, and then you type in npm install. And it's going to look at anything from that package JSON, and it's going to install all of those things. So if I kind of just navigate, for example, into this folder, and let's just bring up my directories, and I'm just going to go 08 tab. There we go. All right, so if I just list out what's here, I see I have a package JSON. So if you had just pulled this down and you're following along and you navigated into this folder, you have to get really used to working on the command line with Node. And once you do, you get used to all the things you need to do. But the first thing you need to do is just go npm install. Now, for me, I've already done this, so it's kind of going to go through and it's going to say, okay, there's not too much to worry about. But for anyone else, you potentially might need to do this. Now, the other thing that you need to do when you're working with Express is that you need to install Express. So npm install Express is how you install Express. And it will go through, and you'll see that it's kind of working a little bit, and it will, you see all these new things that show up. And you're starting to see, okay, well, I've got all these things that Express also requires in order to work. So I've installed Express. You will also need to go npm install Jade. Again, I've done this. It's going to go through the process again, and it's going to go and it's going to install those things. All right. That's how you need to get started with it at the very, very beginning in order just to even work with Express. So you need to have Express installed. You need to have, for example, we're using Jade. Maybe you might be using a different templating engine at some point in time that you're more familiar with or that you like. But, for our example, we're using Jade. And so once you've done that and you've hit npm install, so any of these modules that you've gone in and you're trying to run them or you're trying to, use any of them, make sure that before you do, you navigate to the directory and you hit npm install. And it will go through that package JSON and it will install any of the things that are listed as dependencies. Because otherwise what's going to happen is you're going to go and run that, you're going to run Node, you're going to run, the app.js, most of them are called, and then you're going to realize, oh, okay, something's happening here, I got an error, I need to fix it. Usually it's just installing your modules. You kind of get used to it.
Can you show us what the package.json looks like?
Sure.
This module?
Yeah. So this is what it looks like from this module. So you can start to see what the dependencies are here, right? So we know that this is going to be, some description about the project itself, right? I've got the name, the version. So this is really handy if you're doing any kind of versioning, right? And I'm looking at your GitHub and I'm like, oh, did he update? Oh, awesome. It's still 000, no update. You can start to communicate that to the community this way, right? Author, name, email, in case you want to get email and support your project, as everyone does, right? You're like, I just did it. Try to make it work. And then you got your dependencies that are listed. Do you want to talk a little bit about the dependencies or, any of these kind of things?
Yeah, so if you've noticed when she was running npm install Express, if you add a -- save, what that will actually do is it'll add it to the package.json. So the next time that you get this module, and let's say that it depends on 20 different modules, you don't need to remember each one. You don't need to npm install each one. You can just run npm install, and what that will do is it will read whatever the dependencies are in package.json and install them for you. Right. So here's an example that Stacy can do. Maybe you can install underscore and save it. You can see what happens to...
so npm install underscore -- save, right?
Yep.
If I'm installing that, it should be pulling it down, and just that -- save is basically saying, hey, go put it back to my package JSON, update this file, right?
That's right.
So I'm doing that. I get a whole bunch of messages. It's like, I love you, messages. And then, of course, you get the, hey, this has been modified. What do you do? Of course, I say yes, right? And then we see underscore, right? So do you want to talk a little bit about the syntax here that you start to see in terms of like what a star might mean, or, you know?
Yeah, so this syntax that you're seeing is called semantic versioning, and essentially it'll specify which version that you want Express to be in. And in the first case, we're specifying the exact version that we want, 3.4.4. Now, for Jade, you'll see the star,
Yep.
and what the star means is just install any version of Jade.
Yeah. I don't care.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
like, I don't
Give it
care.
to me
Just like,
all. Yeah.
whatever,
Yeah.
whichever one's the latest one, get
Yeah.
that one.
Whatevs.
Whatevs.
Whatevs. Yeah.
And the underscore one is a little special, though. It's got this little hat. I don't know
little
what
carrot.
it's called. The carrot. Yeah, I don't know what it's called.
Carrot. Looks like a carrot. Totally does not look like a carrot.
But all that's going to do is going to say that, hey, I want 1.7 and then any minor version up of that one specifically. So if it's the latest one is 1.7.2, it's going to get that one. If it's 1.7.3, it's going to get one. Or if it's still 0, then we'll use that one.
Right.
Now, one thing I do want to show you with Node Tools for Visual Studio, if you installed it, maybe we can hop to my screen. And one thing you'll notice that if I did not run npm install, you'll notice on the side, if I open up the npm little symbol,
Yeah.
direction arrow,
You'll get nothing.
You'll get nothing. And it'll tell you. So Visual Studio will actually read the package.json and say, hey, you're missing a bunch of modules.
It's so friendly. It's just like, hey, buddy.
Yeah, you won't be able
Install.
to run this.
Yeah.
A neat
Yeah.
feature, if you don't want to use the command prompt, you can just right-click on npm and it'll give you all these options. Install new npm packages,
Yeah.
install missing ones,
Yeah.
update npm packages, and that will do exactly what you did on the command prompt, just Visual Studio will run it for you.
Yeah.
You don't need to...
Yeah.
Go
So if you're one of
yourself.
those people who's a little afraid of like living the 80s dream of, living in the command prompt, Visual Studio kind of like exposes some of those things, so you don't
That's
spend
right.
as much time.
And if you don't believe me that it's the same function call, it'll actually just show you in the output
Yeah.
right here on my screen. Here it is. This
Yeah.
is the command that it executed, npm install.
Yeah. So friendly. It's like a nice little reminder. So, if we look at this app.js, which we kind of walked through in the previous example on the slide, we're going to go ahead and we're just, going to basically run this app and see what happens. So according to this, I should be running on 8080 as this port.
Yeah.
Right. So what you need to do is I'm going to go into the command prompt again, and I'm already in that folder. So I'm going to go node app.js. I don't need to specify a port. Now, if you don't have a port listed and you want to override that, it's basically -p, and then you put in whatever number you want. So 9,000, for example. But we don't need to do that. We've got it listed. So that's just, a good to know for you. So node.app.js. Hold on. Thrown an error. This is always fun, because then you get to see what's going on here. Oh, you know what? Let's change that port, because maybe something's using it. Remember, this happened when we were doing this the other day.
True.
So I'm just going to change this to be 7001, let's say. Something crazy. And just tab up. And there we go. We know that something's kind of going on. And I can open up my browser and I can go to localhost, and it was 1001, I believe. And you can see this being written back, right? And so we've kind of modified IE so that it actually writes back the string rather than download the file here. If you're working in another browser, you might have a JSON viewer that'll show it all nicely formatted, but you can start to see that we simply created an API, we're writing back some data, right? So this, for me, I love working with Node in this way to create simple APIs, especially if I'm working with someone who's doing the server side and I don't know what the data is going to be quite yet, and you kind of agree, you have that contract for the data model, and you're like, okay, I know it should be like this. okay, I take that, I emulate it, however I need to emulate it, and I'm doing that actual process of going out and getting, hitting the URL, getting the data, bringing it back, and then when I go to switch it, to the actual produced kind of services, in theory, I'm going to hope that, it goes way smoother than, me just kind of writing this object internally and kind of bringing it back. You'll see in the URL here, anything that we're talking about in terms of port, super important because you could be running Node, you could be running a Python app, you could be running a whole bunch of things. They're going to take up ports. And so just understanding that port is your identifier, and you need to always remember what that item is. Let's go back a little bit to just Visual Studio Express. Now, if you had that error like I had, for example, where, it's throwing you an error and you're thinking, everything's installed, I'm not quite sure what's going on here, just try a different port. Your port might be blocked. Something might be running on it. You might not know. First things first, don't worry about all the apps that will show you what's running on ports or anything. Just try a different port right away. See if that works. The other thing is sometimes, if you're working in the command prompts, you might have a couple instances of something running because you forget, I'll just create a new command prompt and start something. Close out your command prompts, then start it again.
Yeah.
So, that's a basic kind of API for Express in a nutshell. And so you can take that quite a bit further, obviously. Now, I was going to go to another slide, but what I'm going to just talk about here briefly is, we're just doing something that's getting on that URL. We could change this URL, so we can add in another route if we wanted to here. So I could say, for example, home, right? And if if you went to this URL home, I could change this message, I could change this response, and that's how you start to work with the routing. This, for example, we just wrote back a basic JSON message. This is like your hello world of simple REST APIs, right? But you could, at some point here, do something on the server side where maybe you're requiring a Node module that's going to go and get the latest data from an authorized user on Facebook or something. And you might go and get that process here, or go to the database, for example, here, and then return it, right? So those are some of the things that you can kind of do. We should talk a little bit about middleware and the idea of middleware. We don't have an example necessarily in here.
Actually, Project 7.
Oh, there you go. Oh, sorry, I went right to the rest and I didn't do... my bad.
Problem. If you open app.js on Project 7...
We can walk through this. This is actually the best one to walk through.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you'll notice...
Forgot about that.
Yeah, middleware is this idea of being able to stick other request handlers right before your own request handler. So you can chain handlers so that you can execute other things like, for example, handle the templating language that you're using, or handle the JSON formatting. So you can attach all of these middleware that will execute so if you think about it, you get the new request, it'll execute all these middleware in order before it gets to your callback.
Right. So I go to the URL and I say I'm going /students, right? And so, for example, you take that request and you might have some middleware, whatever that middleware that might be, and maybe it's going to go and format that in a certain way. Right? Maybe it's going to go and store it somewhere else, or aggregate those things. So it's the middleman, right?
Exactly.
It intercepts it, basically, does whatever it needs to do, does its magic, forwards on that stuff to you.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, so if we actually pop up that project and go to app.js, there's a really interesting middleware that I'd like to show, and that's on line 25. And I'll show you line 24 as well. What you'll notice what line 24 does is it requires a module called Stylus that Stacy will show you in a future part of this course. And what it does is say, hey, for this Stylus module, get me the middleware, and I'm going to pass it a path to a folder to the public folder. And what this middleware is going to do is anytime that there's a .style file, it will actually compile it into a CSS file. So we'll explain what all that means in a second. And the next thing that I do want to show is this express static function. So if you wanted to just serve straight out files and not have to handle any specific custom request, you can literally just serve your files with that. And what it'll do is it'll take a look at the public folder as we path to it, pass to it, and anything that's in the path of that public folder will just get returned right away.
I think, and going through this example, it begs us to kind of walk through a little bit of the folder structure that Express creates for you, right?
That's right.
And so Express does have a sense of folder structure. You can use something that's like, it's called Express Generator, where, you can install npm Express Generator and then create an Express. It's simply like a command. It's like Express. You specify what kind of style sheets or preprocessor you want to use or whatnot, and it'll create that structure for you.
Right.
So if you're looking at an Express project, you tend to have things that are going to be in different folders for structure-wise. And so you'll have things like views, routes, right? You have a public folder. Public folder is client side. So it's like your JavaScripts. It's going to be your CSS that you need. It's going to be any images that you're trying to pull in, right? Anything that you're used to as a front-end developer, you might have in an assets folder or something along those lines. You might call it that. That's actually public. I'm going to show this to the public. And so that's where you can start to see the separation of client-side versus server-side JavaScript. Views tend to hold your templating, right? So if we go to my screen, you'll see in this kind of example right here, you'll see the views have an index and a layout, right? And then you'll also see, so that's usually where you put your templates for views. Again, the beauty of using a template is that you can use it again and again. So if you're building something that's very much like a web application, chances are, you're going to have a list item that you just iterate over again and again. You're going to, you're going to have any of that kind of HTML stuff that, you need to kind of write to the page that you repeat. So that's one of the nice things about templates. You just put them there and you're good. Now, you might have routes, and so you might separate your routes. And, a great example is that, your basic route might be your index.js, right? So that's like you're just into your root. But you might have / student or user. So you might create a JavaScript that just handles that. And then again, you have your public folder, which has, style sheets, JavaScripts, images, depending on how you've structured your project. If you use preprocessors, you might have something along these lines that, another folder that, like you said, takes that, compiles it, serves it up, whatever you need to do. So this, just taking a look at this, is very much the standard kind of, any kind of layout or structure that you get for an Express app. And it's probably best to follow that because, it's pretty much the industry standard. You have things like Yeoman or any of those generators that can kind of, lay out their project for you. So, that's probably one of the best things to go through. If we kind of just walk through this app, fairly quickly, we can kind of just walk through a couple other things that Express has or exposes to you so that you're a little bit more familiar. I went right to the simple demo, but we have, basically creating an Express app. You can, again, set all your environment stuff. You can say, here's the path to where my views are, for example. So anytime I want to use a view, you already know where the path is.
So what's a view exactly?
For a view would be any kind of like templating snippet of, depending on what templating engine you use, it's going to be what you use to kind of return back and write to the page in that response, right? When you're responding with HTML, for example.
So you could return an HTML view.
Sure.
Or a Jade in this case.
Sure. Yep, whatever templating that you're using. For example, the next thing that we specified was which view engine are we using? We're using Jade here, right? Mm-hmm. Then you got all sorts of other things that you can start to kind of get into. And the one thing about Express that's really lovely is that their documentation is actually really good. You have to go through it. You have to read it. You have to be not me, basically. But once you do, the documentation is good. So, you can start to realize how to do a lot of other things. So, we're going through and we see all of these kind of different features, whether it be like how you're going to log stuff out, whether, you're going to use JSON, all this kind of stuff. And again, going down, we talked a little bit just about the middleware. idea that, okay, I'm going to use some middleware here. Stylus is a pretty popular one for middleware, but I mean, there's a bunch of them.
And these are all middleware. Anytime that you use the function app.use, you're inserting
Fundamentally,
middleware.
yeah. And then, just walking through, you can start to see, if you're a dev who works locally and then maybe has a couple environments where you're pushing to production and then you're pushing to staging, you might set up your environment here where you're trying to figure out like what environment you're running. And you can start to figure out those kind of things, whether you want to use logging or you got to set other stuff up, however you might be doing that. And then you can set your routes. And, again, we're just showing get here. So, you have app.get. And again, you're just going to the index. And what it's going to do is it's going to look at the routes, and we have that routes in the folder, and it's going to basically call that function, right?
So what's happening here is routes is as a module. So if you open up the folder, any folder or node can be considered a module. And if you go to the top of that file, you'll notice that we're requiring this folder called routes. So right at the top, you'll see it right there. That is the folder that we're requiring, and we're requiring the module user as well.
Right.
So when you call require, by default, Node will get the index.js file. If you need to require another file in that folder, you can pass it the path.
Right.
So that's what's happening here. We're pathing the path to the routes folder, and by calling the require function, we're loading that code or importing it into our current app.js.
And so when we say, hey, when this route is found or defined, right, this string, whatever it may be, call this function, you can just take a look at this. You know that it's been declared here. And we're looking for something that's been exported on it called index, a function of some sort. So the beauty of this is if I look through this, and if you've set this up, and I go through this, I can start to see where things are pathed. And now you're separating out your logic, you're separating out all the concerns, right? And so things start to become very organized. And so I can go into this index.js, and it's just that whole module and exports idea that we've seen across the board, and many other things. And you see, what are you exporting from this kind of module? It's this function that's called index. And so this is what should happen, when I hit that kind of home page or that index page, right? If we look at the routes for user, there we go. Thought for a second doing a switch, I was like, you can see something, different might happen. Now again, we're only exporting here one function, but you could have a list of things. So you could have anything to do with users, right? Anything to do with users, whether you're modifying, getting a particular user, you could put it all in this one place. And same with any, you might have another thing that's, users and then has something to do with their locations or something along those lines. You might have a different file or you might map it the same. So you tend to organize things. Routing kind of becomes king, right? Because you tend to organize. That becomes your kind of object domain. And everything gets organized in that way.
So one thing that I'd like to ask you that I noticed when we were looking at index.js, we're using a new function to send the response. It's
right.
Render.
Right. So when you're using render, the idea of render is basically exactly what it says. I want you to render something back to the page, not send something back, not JSON. This is what I want you to do. I'm going to render, meaning pretty much render a template. And so you're going to look for that index template, and it's passing some data. And so the beauty here is that, this object here is, a JSON object that's any kind of data. And so that data is usually what your template requires or uses or needs, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm going to expect that there should be a title variable in that template, and I want to use basically this template. So if we go down to our views and we hit open the Jade, there is a title variable there, right? But you can start to see, and we're not going to go through too much about Jade and how this works, but you can start to, well, at least not in this module, I promise you it's coming, but you can see anytime you see these curlies, this is, you know, an ongoing thing among templating. You'll see it in frameworks. It usually means that you're taking that and you're substituting it. Right? So I'm going to take this title variable, whatever it may be, and I'm going to substitute it.
And I believe the reason they use curly braces is because in HTML, there's no use for curly braces.
Yeah.
It's really rare that people will even put curly braces in their text.
Yeah.
So it's a
unless it's like a code block, which you know you're wrapping or something along those lines. Yeah. So you'll start to see, you know, how those things start to get mapped out. So if you went back to here, you know, you might have more variables. This might be a response from something else. You can start to see how it gets, you know,
maybe data
built
from
up.
your database.
Pardon me. Totally. It could be from anywhere.
Yeah.
And right now we're just doing something very, very simple. So you start to see how these keywords really matter. We saw JSON, we saw render, we see, you know, all those kind of things.
Now, I like demos. I like to see proof that things are being done. So why don't we run this app?
Here we go. Okay, let me navigate. Let me close this out. Let me open up the command prompt again. Let me navigate to the folder because I couldn't possibly be prepared. 07, right? Tab. Here we go. Okay, so I see there's an app.js. Now, do you feel like there's a standardized naming convention for like your entry point into your app? Do you think it's always app.js or index.js or?
Now, some people like to use different names. In theory, you should be specifying that name in the package.json file.
Right.
Now, I like to use app.js because we are building apps with Node, so it makes complete sense for me, and it's typically the name that's used by most
very intuitive.
developers. Yeah.
Could have been like run me now.
Yeah, it could have been that, but I like app.js.
Okay, so first thing I'm going to do just in this folder, I've done it already, but you know, I'm a little paranoid. As always, just pull down this project. I'm going to install stuff. I just want to make sure that, you know, everything's good. Looks like it's great. So now I'm going to go app.js. Okay, awesome. It's telling me it's listening on port 3000. So let's bring this up. No longer my 7001. Goodbye. Let's go to 3000. Let's see if this works. There you go. So I've got a basic kind of Express framework working. Now, we had users, right?
That's right.
And
that is the response that we sent back.
So you start to see that, you know, you would obviously get something here that if this was going to, you know, that route wasn't found. And then you can start to supply templates for, you know, for those kind of things like a 404, route not found, whatever you need to do. But you start to see that we get, you know, the basic routing that's in place there. And this idea, when you first kind of create your Express app, this is what you see. It's Express. It's welcome to Express. And the first thing you usually go and do is you kind of go and try to change that title or whatever you're trying to do, right? But we see that it's working and that everything's kind of running on port 3000. And you're off to the races with Express. And so in the next couple modules, what we're going to end up talking about, we've covered the basics. We showed you, I skipped ahead because I'm a nerd that way. I was like, yeah, let's just get straight to it. But we're going to kind of try to show you in the next couple modules, basically, okay, you understand Express, you understand how to, you know, put a route down. Okay, we're going to build this out a little bit, and we're going to work a little bit with the templating, and we're going to build out the UI. And so what we're going to create is maybe we'll show in the next module the application as it is, and then we're going to start just walking you through how we put it together and how we built it. And so it really does take the front end, the back end. You know, you're doing going to Mongo, you're using Express, you're using Jade, you're using all those kind of things. Again, you know, you start playing with Express, you can use other templating engines. We're just, you know, using Jade for this thing, you know, today, but you can definitely use other engines in terms of templating that you want. Maybe you're familiar with something else. A lot of people I know who are doing client-side templating, they like underscore or mustache or any of those things. Fine. You use what you're comfortable with. Jade does have a kind of different format, I think, a little bit than some of those other ones. So we'll walk you through that, you know, coming up in the next module. And I think for today, I think it's about time to. I'm starving. So, You know? Oh, so, well, I wish. But I think, I'm starving. Actually, I really am starving. Anyone want to send me a pizza? Has anyone got the address here? So we're gonna start looking at some of those things, whether it's building out the front end or building out the back end. Might do the back end first, and walk you through some of those kind of things. So we're gonna take a break. Thanks for sticking with us for this hour. Yeah.
Hopefully you'll come back. We really want you back here.
We'll take a look at the chat room and we'll try to address some of those questions as well. So we'll take a quick 10-minute break and we'll see you back soon.